Okay, so heart physiology divided into 3 topics. 1, macroscopic normal function. Then macro abnormal function. So like AV block and Afib and diseases. And we'll also talk about the EKG at that point. EKG, ECG, same thing. Cardiac. After that, we will then go into the microscopic normal function. And that's when we'll talk about all the ions and all that jazz. So first, what is going on in the normal heart? So here we have atria and ventricles. In the atria, we have a little node called the SA node, Sinoatrial Node. This is going to be where the action potentials that we're going to talk about begin and are spread. Down here, we have another node called the AV node. The SA node normally will send a signal to the AV node, and the AV node sends it down, and it goes through this bundle. Do you happen to remember what the bundle might be called?
Is it the bundle of His?
Bundle of His. Excellent. So, macroscopically, what is going on when the SA node depolarizes? It's going to basically be behaving like an action potential. And so, the cells around the SA node are all connected by gap junctions. And some of them are connected to the SA node. And so when the SA node, this green box over here, fires off in a way that we'll talk about later, and so that it has an action potential going along its membrane, that action potential will go to the next guy and go along his membrane. That'll make all of his calcium come out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which makes it continue. And that action potential will then go to the next cell, and that'll keep going. These connecting bits are what we refer to as the gap junctions. And that's why we only have to have one place start an action potential, and then all the guys around the SA node go, all the guys around those go, and by going I mean that they fire off and contract. And so they'll go out in an expanding ripple pattern. And they will eventually go from the right to the left, causing the atria to contract, squeeze the blood out of them down into the ventricles, all the way across, the right one going slightly before the left one. Now, you'll notice that this stayed in the atria. There are no gap junctions going across this insulated space between the atria and the ventricles. And so the ventricles aren't going to fire off just because the atria did. That signal is going to be through this nerve right here. It's more of a special set of cells, but nerve basically. And that'll go to the AV node. The AV node just sends it on in this case. The AV node doesn't do anything particularly special, except that at the beginning of the AV node, going all the way down through the bundle of His, it's going to have a very slow propagation of the potential, giving the atria as much time as they need to squeeze and wring out the blood that's up there. Once the atria are done squeezing, roughly, that's about the time it gets down here, and then you have it hit normal muscle cells, and they start radiating upward in a ripple pattern. And then the ventricles will contract. So, that's the pattern. And normally, this will happen It'll happen every minute, roughly 60 to 100 times a minute. That's normal sinoatrial sinus rhythm. So this is for the SA node. If it's slower than this, we have a term for this. Do you happen to remember?
Bradycardia.
Bradycardia.
Brady.
Good. And if it's faster?
Tachycardia.
Tachycardia. All right. So, gap junctions, do those make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Does the separation of atria versus ventricles firing independently make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions?
I'm just trying to now visualize the action, the pumping with the blood flow. I guess, yeah, just the pumping in conjunction with the blood flow. And
Okay.
how that's all happening. Does that make sense, or do you need more?
I think it makes sense. If the explanation I give doesn't cover it, then
Okay.
let me know. So, when everybody's relaxed in between heartbeats, blood can come into the atria from the inferior and superior vena cava. That'll go in here. And then when the sinoatrial node fires off, that'll start the atria contracting. That pressurizes the blood and opens a valve from the atria down to the ventricle. That squeezes the blood out. Most of the blood is actually moving by gravity. Only, and this is a made-up number, but 10 to 20%, maybe less, is actually being wrung out by the muscle. If your atria stop working, you can actually survive because most of it's done by gravity. But since the ventricle isn't squeezing yet, because it's very slow to get started, you can squeeze out of the atria into a relaxed and accepting ventricle.
Okay.
Once that's done, then this guy has doors like this.
Mm-hmm.
If the ventricle starts to squeeze, which it does, it will then squeeze. These doors are going to slam closed, but they can't go further than this, so they just close.
Mm-hmm.
And other doors that are hard to open, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
right here, are going to open, which gives us where all the blood from the ventricles squeezing will go to, and that's going to the lungs. And then the lungs will dump it into the left atria. Simultaneous to everything that we've been saying on the right side of the heart, the left side of the heart kind of has the same story. At the same time this guy was dumping blood, gravity plus squeezing, this guy is also dumping blood, gravity plus squeezing. And then when they both start contracting, these doors, mitral valve, tricuspid mitral,
Yes.
will slam closed, and its exit is called the aorta.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes not to the lungs, but to the whole body.
Yeah.
And so the left side of the heart has to use a lot more pressure to get it through the whole body because the lungs are very short in comparison. But here's a question for you, and then we'll cover and see if there's anything else. Which side of the heart would you say is moving more blood? Does this move more? Does the right side move more blood, the left side, or do they move the same amount?
I think they're moving the same amount. The left side is working harder, or maybe pumping harder or something.
Excellent.
Same amount.
Mm-hmm. So they are the same amount, because where would this get blood if it wasn't
Right.
from the right side?
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, it's just higher pressure on the left side.
A constant flow, so how would there be more in one area than the other, if you will?
Because this eventually is what's dumping it into the superior and inferior vena cava.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
So it's ultimately all happening simultaneously.
Atria together, rest, ventricles together.
Yes, the blood, as far as, so when the blood's coming in through the right atrium,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's going down to the left ventricle and being pushed out, ultimately at the same time it's going through the right atrium.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe slightly split second or something later, it's dumping in to the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle because there's the boom boom. But that would be the atria and then the ventricles.
Right. So this, just
That's
like you said,
boom.
lub, which is the first one, and then dub. Lub is for the atrium, dub is for the ventricles, and it's actually, I should say, lub is for it's actually for the atrial valves, because you hear the valves closing, and then dub is for the ventricular valves.
Opening.
I think they're both closing.
Oh, okay.
Because the opening doesn't really make a sound, you kind of gradually open, but then they slam closed. So.
It's fascinating, but that's what we're actually hearing.
Yeah, right? That was always one of my favorite things.
We open the hearts, and those valves they're just tissues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just kind of thin tissues. It's hard to imagine that they make sound when they're closing. You know?
It's hard to imagine they don't fry after doing that for a couple months. It's like it should be in tatters, but.
Okay, so the blood flow is just, I mean, obviously it's consistent, and it's very much simultaneous when the top is squeezing, pushing blood down. The ventricles are squeezing, pushing the blood out in different directions.
Right. Through, one to the lungs, one to the body.
Okay.
And that's, you got it.
It's pretty fascinating.
Any other questions on the what the heart is doing in a zoomed out sort of a way?
No. I got it.
Okay, awesome. Then let's break it. So, next, we're going to go ahead and draw another heart over here. And this is going to be the heart that we jack up. So, what's this node called?
The Sinoatrial Node.
Yep. What's this node?
The atrioventricular node.
Good. What's this?
Those are the bundle of Phys.
Good. Also known as the Purkinje fibers.
Oh,
good.
the Purkinje fibers. Okay. We need to relate those to each other.
All right. So, for this, is it, yeah, we'll go ahead and do this. So, the heart can have its rhythm messed up in a number of ways. But to talk about that, let's start with normal heart EKG. So, this is called the P wave. This is the Q, R, and S waves. They happen all next to each other, so they're just called the QRS complex. Then we have the T wave. So each of these are, just like the gap junctions are moving electrical current, and so electrical current is really what we're following through all of this. This is just a way of tracking movement of electrical current. And so if there's more electrical current going towards a certain electrode, then it will record it as coming towards the electrode. And so we're just seeing changes in current. So the P wave, I find the easiest way to break up this is by pairing, so the P wave, there are two things that have to do with the atria, is the way that I find it the easiest to learn this. Atria. And so the P wave is when the atria begin to depolarize and then shortly thereafter begin to contract. And that's the P wave. Hidden inside this mess is, so we have go over here, we have stop over here. We have the repolarization of the atria. Most of what you see there is not the repolarization because that's small in comparison to the other thing going on at the same time. But when all of this goes away and so that it was clear again and ready to refire, that's going to be repolarization, and it's hidden in the QRS. Now the green over here is for ventricles. And the ventricles have their go is most of the QRS. Most of the movement is when it finally starts down here and starts to squeeze, that's a depolarization of the ventricles. And then the T wave is the repolarization of the ventricles. Okay? There are some things in the slides that I'm not going to touch on right now, but you will want to know what the difference between intervals and segments are. And there's a PR interval and a QRST interval and things like that, and segments. In the interest of getting through the disease states and things, I think with the time we have, we'll move past that, but know that those are in there. Okay? So, with this going on, now we can talk about diseases and how they jack up your EKG. So, we're going to go ahead and start with AV block. So, actually, there's one other thing I want to do before we get, well, it's part of AV block somewhat. Normal functioning, we talked about the SA node. I didn't talk about the AV node, so let's go ahead and do that now because we need to understand that. SA node is going to send off every between 60 to 100 beats per minute to do this thing, as well as send off the impulse down through the AV node who's just passing it on. However, if the sinoatrial node is broken for some reason, the AV node will go ahead and be its own pacemaker. And so the SA node is the pacemaker before. The AV node, if it fires off though, only talks to the people after it. So if you're relying on your AV node, well, actually I think it can do Atria, but, so what I should be saying is it's much slower, not that it doesn't do something. So.
Okay, and I have in the notes from Dr. Schmidt, we have a backup pacemaker behind the AV node. If that.
That's what we're referring to, and that's at 40 beats per minute.
Okay.
And so, if the SA node is broken, you have the AV node go, and it will send an impulse down the bundle of His and start the ventricles contracting. AV block is when we have kind of an interesting thing going on. Usually the SA node is talking to the AV node and sending it through. AV block is when the SA node is working, but the conduction towards the AV node is not. So we still get the atria firing, but it doesn't talk to the ventricles. And so the AV node is sitting there waiting for someone to come in and tell it to go. And once it's waited long enough, then it'll fire off on its own. What this looks like then is we have P waves, which are the atria firing, going off roughly twice as often than the much slower AV pacemaker, who is not hearing any message, so he's doing it at his own pace. And so you have 2 P waves for every 1 QRS, which will look like and it can be roughly 2 to 1, it's not always exactly. But you could have something that looks like this: P wave, nothing. P wave, QRS, T wave. So you had a P wave, and then where there should have been a QRS, nothing. Because the sinoatrial node got to go twice, and the AV node is much slower. This is called AV block, because you blocked the conduction to the AV node. Make sense? Okay.
So blood is still pumping through there.
Yes. So you still have blood doing coming in, being squeezed out and everything. It's just the atria are squeezing twice for every 1 time that the ventricles are squeezing. So they're kind of out of rhythm. And
does that ever allow for too much blood to pool in the ventricles?
So it can.
Is that way ahead of us?
I'm thinking here, what it could put more blood into the ventricles. I'm thinking the more likely to be an issue sort of a thing would be if the ventricles are squeezing, because this P wave could be right over a QRS because they're not talking to each other. And so trying to force it in at the same time that it's squeezing is going to make so the...
So there could there potentially be a backflow?
So these doors don't open backwards unless the valves break. And so what's more likely to happen, although that's a good idea, is
they won't open as far.
This has a lot of pressure going like this, so they won't open as far, if at all. And that means that you have a lot of pressure building up in the atria that is squeezing, kind of like if you took a water balloon. And if you squeeze the water balloon and it has a nozzle, then it'll fire out if it's open. So then it would just fire the water out. But if there's nowhere for it to go, it'll bulge, and that's what would happen in the atria.
Okay.
And so you can have, I would suppose it could lead to atrial hypertrophy and things like that over time. And I think that would probably be, to my thinking, this is now just me thinking it out, the more likely concern. But that's just me thinking it out. There might be extra blood going down here. That could be an issue. Yeah, good question. I don't know beyond that, though.
So then does this create like a defib or anything like that?
That is a good question, and not really. What's going on is still regular in its rhythm. It's just separated from being, so the atria are on a regular rhythm, the ventricles are on a regular rhythm, so no one is doing fibrillation.
Okay.
Fibrillation, just to define it, are you familiar?
Yeah, but you can, it'd be good to review it.
Okay, so let's take the water balloon again. If you squeeze it and make a bulge, everybody's working together, you're putting pressure all at the same time, and then it goes to a place. Fibrillation is if I was just twitching various fingers, and then
there's no pumping action?
They're not working together. So I might be squeezing over here and then over here, but it's not all squeezing at the same time.
Okay.
And so it doesn't lead to very much pressure being built up at any given time. And that is actually our next two, Afib and then Vfib. Afib looks like this. Jiggity, 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 QRS, jiggity, jiggity, T, jiggity, jiggity, jiggity. And it would even be jiggity through the T and the QRS because the atria are constantly doing a little bit of firing, so they constantly give you this kind of sawtooth looking pattern. Afib is the worst kind of atrial fibrillation. I mean, it's atrial fibrillation. There are slight, and this is like at 300 plus, sinoatrial node saying go 300 plus times a minute. There are some less severe ones called atrial flutter, which is the same thing. It's just a little bit slower, so it's not quite as bad. You're moving blood at least somewhat coordinated. And then there's also just atrial tachycardia. And that one is your atria are going faster, but at least they have a little bit more of a normal
they're not doing all
rhythm.
Okay.
So they might not be, they're going too fast, but they aren't in fibrillation. Afib is the one that we're focusing on and that he might ask you about.
Okay.
But these three are just fast, faster, fastest.
Okay.
Vfib, just going to bind these two together because it's the same thing. You would have...
just in the ventricles.
Yeah, and actually this would be really small. That would be really small because, and jiggity, 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 jiggity. So your atrial will be there, sort of normal, your P wave. And there would be some sort of stuff going on in here. It'd be a mess. And then you'd have just a little bit over here, if anything. And this is the one that can kill you.
Okay. Yeah, that looks like it would.
Whereas atria, if they're doing fibrillation, gravity does 80% of their work, roughly. So even if they stop working altogether, you technically can still live. It would affect like exercise and stuff like that when you need to start using it a little bit more, but in rest, you could survive all right, most of the time. Vfib, if you can't get blood out to the body, you're toast. Gravity doesn't help with that. So after you have a heart attack, it's actually restarting in an organized pattern that is what will mean that you survive or don't survive a heart attack.
Oh.
Vfib follows a heart attack because you've just done some weird patterns can you get back into a normal pattern. And that's the killer.
And that's where like the defibrillator would come in, the AED.
Exactly.
Where now, so someone's had a heart attack, their heart is now in VFib, and we're gonna shock them or send an electric current through them to try to get the heart back on normal rhythm.
Exactly.
Okay.
You're trying to get every cell to fire at the exact same time so that they all come into rest at the same time and they're all ready to go again at the same time.
This makes so much sense.
Right? Isn't it a great topic?
Oh my gosh.
Makes me happy.
Yeah, okay, so like the defib, that's why we're sending one, well, it might be multiple shocks, but they're not at the same time. You send one, and it's really important that it's just one at a time if there needs to be more, because the heart is on like one. You said it, you were just saying it.
Fibrillation means it's going here, and then a few seconds later here, and it's not this ripple pattern where it's like squeeze, like wringing a sponge kind of a thing. Instead, it's like tickling a water balloon. Doesn't do any good. No pressure buildup.
Yeah.
So you're trying to get them all to go at once.
The one shock creates the electricity for everything to happen simultaneously, because that's how the heart would beat normally, is simultaneous.
Yes, so the shock makes them all go, and that's close to the way the heart normally goes, because usually it's this one, rest, then this one. That particular one might sort of help, but it gets them all into the rest state. After they all go, they're all in the rest state at the same time. The next shock, if you will, or the next start isn't from the defibrillator, it's from the SA node going down in a normal way. And since everyone's ready to listen to it at the same time, no one is still in there. I'm still squeezing, you can't turn me on again, so I'm going to be making all the people around me squeeze, but then those guys are going with you, and we're not doing it coordinated. If everyone is in rest at the same time, then you can have the ripple go out through it in a nice, organized pattern.
Wow.
And that's what's going on.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. It's cool stuff.
It's crazy that somebody figured all that out.
Right?
Multiple people through the years.
And you gotta wonder, like, who was the first one who was like, let's do this? You know, like, I really want to shock someone who's having a heart attack. This should totally work.
I know,
It doesn't.
work. They're gonna die anyway.
Right? Oh my gosh. I can just hear that reasoning.
Right.
This is not making me feel better. Do it on someone who's unconscious having a heart attack, please. So, let's see, AV block, AFib, VFib, and then the fun one, ectopic. All right, so ectopic.
I only heard of that in unborn babies, but that's more like ectopic pregnancy.
Oh yeah, and it's actually ectopic pregnancy is when the implantation is
in the fallopian tubes.
Right, in a weird place, fallopian tubes, not inside the wall of the uterus. This is the same thing. It is a weird place. So we have the SA node. That is our normal pacemaker. We have our backup, the AV node, which is our slower pacemaker. Sometimes with AV block, you can have one going and the other one going, and they're not listening to each other, but at least they're still doing a regular thing with their half of the heart. Okay. Ectopic, though, is this one, or this one, or maybe this one.
They're just random.
Or that one.
Firing.
Exactly.
Random action. Are they random action potentials?
They are random cells causing action potentials to start from them. And it could be because cancer can do anything it wants. Like literally, almost. It's like cancer could cure the common cold. Or it can make a random tooth stick out of your elbow. That one can happen. It's called a teratoma. They're great.
Oh my goodness.
So it could be cancer. It could be a mutation that's not cancer, but it's a mutation in the cell that makes so that it's just firing off. We'll get into details in a little bit on how firing happens here, but basically it could make them look more like an SA node. It doesn't really matter exactly if it's trauma, cancer, or mutation, or anything else. Whatever it is, if one of them fires off, they have gap junctions. Exactly. So then you got a ripple, got more of a ripple, got more of a ripple, and
the ripples interact with each other.
Yep. And then you have these ripples coming up. And when they hit here, kind of like a forest fire hitting a burned out area. There's nothing to burn there. The fire can't go through. And so, or all of these guys are in rest state, or they're already contracting, and the rest state where they can't fire again yet. They haven't finished resting. And so this guy, you had to squeeze up halfway, and then the rest of it went already, so it can't. So you have, like, in this example, ectopic, it totally depends on where it starts. But you could have 3/4 of the ventricles squeezing just fine. This guy squeezed early, and so then they can't pass the signal through them. And so maybe you would have it get around up here, and it would be late, which would be really weird. It's like squeeze and then finish squeezing that way, which is not super helpful. But because it can't do anything right there. So ectopic is kind of the hardest one to draw. So I'm going to draw a normal thing first. An ectopic could be part of your ventricular wave was stolen because it already went. And it was stolen and it actually went right there. And so you had it early. Or it could be atria. You had some of your atrial waves stolen, it went early, and then it went like that. Or you could have more than one of them, and then you just start looking really janky. So you're just shifting the waves around, and sometimes the shape of the stolen portion doesn't stay looking like a mini, like I made this roughly, very roughly, like a mini QRS. It doesn't necessarily look like a mini QRS shifted, but you have taken some of the QRS wave and moved it somewhere else, even if it looks like that, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So the short way of saying it is ectopic looks like whatever it wants to.
A mess.
Yeah.
Extremely random.
Exactly. So those are kind of the macroscopic diseases. So we've gone through normal, we've gone through diseases, and then the last thing is microscopic. How the heck are all of these things, are the pacemakers firing off? What makes them fire? And then, what do normal muscle cells look like when they fire? And I'm doing both because atria and ventricles are the same. They both have gap junctions in the way that they work, so we're just going to tie them together. So we're just going to say cardiac muscle cells, MC. And over here, we have SA/AV. We're going to go ahead and start with the cardiac cells. And with the cardiac cells, it looks something like this. That's the resting state. They are doing nothing, but they are ready. It's not refractory. Refractory meaning I am so wiped out I can't be turned on unless you literally put electricity onto the body. No ions are ready to do it in a normal way. So the body can't turn it on, but a defibrillator can still do it because that's like direct electricity. It's not relying on ions. Then you have some electricity comes in and fires, and that electricity opens channels. So the gap junctions just rippled out to there, and we had the ion current, which is an electric differential, coming in, and that electric differential is just like turning a light switch, and it opens a sodium channel. So, and this is what we call phase 0. Sodium open. And sodium flows in. Okay. Then, so that was 0, and we have 1. 1 is when potassium goes out and it opens. I'm not going to write open every time. I'm just going to write.
Well, doesn't the sodium one closed?
It does. That happens at the same time. And I will use red for the other closure as well. So, And then it does this kind of a slopey thing, and then it goes down quickly. Right there we have another one, right there we have another one, and right there we have another one. And that should be a little more gradual, so I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 2, so number 1, really quick. So the sodium coming in, sodium is a positively charged ion, so it coming in raises the electrical potential inside the cell. And once it gets above a certain line, roughly here we'll say, then it opens the potassium channels. It's just a light switch waiting for that amount of ion to be present, that amount of electricity to be present, and that opens the potassium and it begins depolarization, because whereas we were dumping positive ions in with sodium, now we're dumping positive ions out with potassium. And so if we're dumping positive out, it's of course going to depolarize. However, in a normal action potential, this would just plummet all the way down and we'd be done.
Like skeletal muscle.
Right. In this one, however, we have another ion that deals with phase 2 and phase 3. That ion is calcium. You got it. So calcium will come in at number 2, and it will come out. Actually, it's more like it just closes. At phase 3. So if we have positive things being dumped out of the cell, and then we have positive ones being dumped into the cell, so potassium's leaving, calcium's coming in, those are balancing each other. And that balance is what forms this plateau. So these two together, the 2 and the 3, both have to do with calcium, and they are the plateau phase. This is what makes so that the heart muscle doesn't do a brief contraction. It actually holds it, squeezes, and wrings it out. And so this is what makes sure that we're going to have most of the blood move rather than just how much you can do with a quick, like a squeeze and let go. It's a squeeze, ring, and let go. If you're increasing cardiac force, what you're doing is increasing how long the plateau phase lasts. You're releasing more calcium from the cells have sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is basically endoplasmic reticulum, as I'm sure you know. It's how much calcium they're willing to let out of that storage is what makes the plateau bigger, shorter, or longer. And that's also, again, related to how much time you spend ringing, how much force. Fourth one is just the potassium closing.
You're doing really well with the space you have.
All right. So, concept question.
Repolarization.
Right, and rest and refractory are the flat lines, so just waiting. Here's the concept question. What starts this whole thing going? Is it a funny channel or is it gap junctions?
Oh, we talked about the funny channels, and those are the essays. They're in the essays. Funny channel.
Okay, so kind of.
Wrong.
So, not the one I was looking for. Funny channel is what we're going to see over here for the SAAV node starting to go off. These guys don't have a funny channel in their cell. They have a gap junction that leads it to them.
Okay.
And the reason I asked that is because everyone that I've asked, including myself the first time going through it, always wants to say funny channel because it's the cool one. So I just wanted to ask to get it out of our system.
I'm glad we asked.
So
Glad we got it out of the system.
Gap junction, and then over here we have funny channel. And just to tie up, let's see if we got time. Okay, let's make this quick. So, SA node and AV node on the other hand, they look like this, constantly slowly depolarizing, and then they hit a threshold, and they jackknife up, jackknife down, slowly go back. So these guys have...
They start at 4.
They do. I'm going to go ahead and start at 0. You're right, they start at 4, but for explaining purposes, I'm going to start at 0.
0.
So, in the other cell, when we had someone open the sodium channels, basically when they got this gate opened, that was 0. To jackknife it up, that's still the same thing, sodium.
Okay.
Over here we have 1. That's opening the potassium, closing the sodium when it was up to that point. So 0, I guess I'll write down here next to this.
Okay.
That's 1 up here. And that potassium rushing out is what drops it. And then we have 4. Now, here's the funny thing. Literally.
Funny.
The fourth phase in the other guy was a rest phase. It would bring him to a flat line. There are 2 different things in the nodes. Different thing number 1, there is no flat line. Because during the 4 phase, and all the time, there is a tiny sodium channel called the sodium funny channel, or just funny channel, always letting a little bit of sodium through to come in. And that's why we climb slowly. And once we finally climb high enough that it's kind of like a gap junction sending a big thing in, it just took a while to build up. It's no gap junction, it's a funny channel. And eventually we have enough positive things floating around in here that fires off the same kind of big sodium channels that are waiting for polarization to open them, and then a bunch of sodium comes in with the jackknife. So we have a primer, and then the jackknife just the same, potassium just the same. You'll notice we don't have a 2 or a 3. Phase 2 and phase 3 were just the plateau. They were just calcium. Calcium fighting potassium. No calcium is involved in the SA or AV nodes because they aren't muscle cells. We don't need them to squeeze for a long time. We only need them to start the ripple. So there's no need for calcium. So we skip those. So we only have 0, 1, and 4. And then 0, 1, and 4, and 0, 1, and 4. So the 2 differences, I will write. In red, 4 has a funny channel. That's different. And then 2 and 3 don't exist. And so I just wrote 2 X's where they were. You have 0, 1, XX, 4. 4 is different because of the funny channel. Everything else is the same. So calcium, not there. Funny channel is added to number 4. 4 plus the funny channel.
Okay. Why? Oh, I know, we both have to keep going. But in here, in the SA action potential, he's got 4, 0, and 3.
4, 0, and 3.
And he says no phases 1 or 2.
Oh, okay.
There's slow depolarization due to special cation channel. And the ion channel stays open. And the regulation of the SA node, the chronotropic effects.
Okay. Thank you for catching that. Instead of it being, let's see, he has 4, 0, and 3, huh?
Yeah, and 4 being the regulation of the heart rate. 3 being the repolarization, and I have noted a little bit of calcium up there, but not much. And slow depolarization slows the heart rate. This came more from what he was talking about. No resting membrane potential. The difference is the special sodium channel, which is the funny channel. So it activates the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, which activate G-protein couple receptors, which inhibit the funny channel. Maybe that's going into something different.
Yeah, inhibiting the funny channel.
Oh, right here.
So That's talking
That's
about
sitting or resting or
hormonal
resting.
control of slowing down the heart rate. So
Okay.
you can make the funny channels bigger or smaller, and that's what will make your rate increase or decrease.
Whether you're resting or exercising,
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, so 0, 1, and 3, glad that you had that up, instead of it being
403.
4, 0, 3, so there's no 1.
And 4 is down there.
Yeah, 4 is going to be the depolarization phase still.
Yeah.
So instead of it being a 1, it's a 3. Cool. So that still has to do with repolarization. I'm glad you said that, though.
Yeah.
And calcium is still involved?
A little bit that I have on here.
Okay.
But I want to go, I didn't
Is
get
there
that
any
far.
potassium, I wonder?
Mm,
Okay, well,
I don't think so.
so maybe
I have
it's
I have more
all, but why would calcium?
Wait, increased potassium current involves the G protein coupled receptor
Yeah.
response, which inhibits the funny.
Okay, I would want to double check to see if there is calcium in there, because potassium's the only one that's going to be doing the repolarization. If calcium was involved there, it could be calcium instead of sodium, so these channels at 0 could be calcium. So instead of sodium channels, they're calcium channels, and those would be in the sarcoplasmic reticulum instead of the cell membrane.
And in my diagram, it had an arrow going right up to that spot in that needle up there. So that
Okay,
would
so
make
then
sense.
0 would be calcium,
Calcium.
and 4 would be funny channel, and you'd have 3 that was still potassium. Well, 3 played with calcium in that one, but all right.
Yeah, and then he kind of just jumped ahead to this stuff and kind of back and forth. So
Okay.
there wasn't, and I didn't quite get through the last part of his audio from the second half. So I just started these are the notes that I was taking from listening again to the audio, and we really only got to this point where we kind of started talking about the funny channel and this, but I'm not sure if he brought up this calcium thing yet.
Okay.
So
I'm pretty sure, so on phase 4, that we're positive on doing the funny
look, right
channel.
here. In phase 0 is the calcium current.
Okay.
Yes.
Phase 0, calcium, awesome. And then 3 is potassium, so calcium, potassium, and then sodium funny channel.
And
all right.
so this.
Thank you for seeing that.
Oh, you're welcome. The slow depolarization due to special cation channel.
That's the
Is
funny
that the
channel.
sodium? Okay.
Sodium
That's the
funny
sodium
channel.
coming in.
Exactly.
Which is actually then in 4, right? Yeah. You've got that. Okay,
So,
great.
This is the correct thing, and ignore the other stuff that I was saying.
That's okay.
So 0 is calcium, same idea as the sodium, so you have the funny leading to it, and then when it hits the threshold,
makes it get up there.
calcium
quicker.
does the spike instead of the sodium
that
spike.
Makes sense.
So, and then potassium still does the spike down, which is phase 3, and then you have the should be level for phase 4, but it's got the funny channels, so phase 4 is at the gradual depolarization.
Okay. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Cool.
All right.
Thank you.
Gonna go ahead and close off. Hopefully that helped.